Welcome to the Science Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to talk about our sponsor, thegreatcoursesplus.com. The Great Courses, of course, is the teaching company generating lots of courses. I've done a couple myself, and I listen to them fairly regularly. The Great Courses Plus is their app that you get on your phone. You just touch it, looks like that. Boop, you touch it there. You get a whole host of courses that you can select from. Here's one that I thought was appropriate. Understanding the U.S. government. I think a lot of people don't really understand it. Starting with lectures like, why have government in the first place? So I'm going to start this course today. I'm guessing this has to do with Hobbes and Rousseau and all the early theoreticians about the social contract. And then lecture 2, the framework of U.S. federalism. Lecture 3 on civil liberties. And on down the line, how a bill becomes a law, why Congress is such a puzzle, how presidential elections work, and so on. This seems rather relevant. Anyway, I've been getting a lot of mail from my commercials I'm making here for them, since they're our only sponsor of the podcast, other than the Skeptic Society, of course. And that is somebody loves this lecture, they didn't like that one, or they tried this course and then they changed to another course. That's the beauty of the Great Courses Plus app, is you can just skip around, as opposed to just purchasing a full course on the teaching company website, in which you have the whole course. So you either listen to it or you don't. Here you can just bounce around. So give it a try. It's a free trial if you do it through us, through the Salon. So it's thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon, SALON. That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. And you can get a free trial and bounce around and try it and see how you like it. All right, thanks for listening. My guest today is David Barash and his new book, Threats, Intimidation, and its Discontents. David is an evolutionary biologist and professor emeritus of psychology at the University of Washington. He's written more than 280 peer-reviewed articles and 40 books. Barash has penned op-eds in the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and the Chicago Tribune, as well as numerous pieces in the Chronicle of Higher Education, Nautilus, and Skeptic. Anyway, David's a longtime good friend, super smart guy, interesting perspective on many important social issues. So we talk about 2020 in comparison to, say, 1968, Watergate, Vietnam, and all that stuff in context of what we've been going through this year. And we also talk a little bit about racism and Black Lives Matter and the history of race in America, all that, a bit of a sidebar to the important subject of his book, which is nuclear deterrence. So he talks about the logic of deterrence in animals, organisms, and why organisms develop technologies of deterrence, claws, shells, and fur, and fangs, and so forth. All that makes perfect sense, but in the last century, things have gone crazy with nuclear weapons. So we get into talking about all the different aspects of game theory as it applies to nuclear strategy, mutual assured destruction, first strike capability, launch on warning, and all the different strategies that have evolved over the decades to deter what we fear may be real but may not be. And so I think we end on a fairly optimistic note of, we now know how to get to nuclear zero, both strategically and technologically. Politically, that's another issue, and that remains to be seen. In any case, I think this is probably one of the most important podcasts I've done, because the subject is so important. This issue is not going to go away once Biden takes over on January 20th in 2021. Nuclear weapons are still going to be around for some time to come, so we do have to deal with this. Anyway, with that, I give you David Barash. Threats, Intimidation, and its Discontents. I see in the bio for you that this is your 40th book. I can't believe you've written 40 books. I feel like a slacker.
You are hardly a slacker, Michael.
But, one of the things I admire about you is not only are you a world-class scientist and writer, but an activist. That is, you like to apply the methods and discoveries of science to solving social social problems. You're a longtime social activist and anti-nuclear, which we'll discuss because that's part of your book. But I thought, just since we're recording this at the end of toward the end of 2020, and we'll release it in December, if you might kind of give us some reflection on this year we've just been through, 2020, and it's not over. The pandemic, the economic, catastrophe and collapse because of the economic shutdown, all the Black Lives Matter movement, the continuation of the Me Too movement. I mean, there's been like multiple hits. Has there been anything like this? Is this a recency effect? Or, maybe comparable to 1968 or, Watergate or Vietnam, or I don't know. Just give us some thoughts on how you think about this year.
I have to confess that this year has been so perplexing and such whiplash. I'm not sure I've had much of a chance to actually think about it. I've been more vibrating as a result of it and reacting or trying to. I think there is a degree of recency effect, as you called it. I suspect if you were to question people going all the way back to Aristotle, they would say these are the most remarkable and troublesome and dangerous times in the history of the world.
Yeah.
But I think they are.
Yeah.
I think they are. I'm not. Well, I haven't lived since Aristotle. I'm 74, and I've been politically aware really since the Eisenhower administration. And I don't recall a time when things were as disrupted and as disruptive as they are now on so many dimensions. We had the Vietnam War. Certainly, we had the civil rights movement. There was the early ramification of the anti-nuclear anxiety, particularly during Reagan. But it seems like these were one at a time, and they weren't coming at us every day and several different dimensions per day. I desperately hope that with a new presidential administration coming in, we'll all be able to take a breath, and that maybe some of these issues will also be increasingly resolved. But they certainly weren't resolved under the Trump administration. Indeed, in just about every dimension, I think they were made worse. So let's all hope. I have to say, my wife and I this morning, after having gotten the word that both Pennsylvania and Nevada had certified the election results on top of Michigan yesterday, we asked Alexa, I'm saying it softly because I don't want her to wake up, to play Hit the Road, Jack.
Right.
The old Ray Charles song. We played it quite loudly and had a good time.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly Trump has been, say, several standard deviations out from the mean of presidents, that's for sure. As we speak, of course, it's not guaranteed it's going to be a perfectly peaceful transfer. He hasn't officially conceded. But nevertheless, let's just assume that the Biden administration takes over and gets to work on January 21st. So to get into your book, most of these big issues are still going to be there. I mean, Iran, North Korea, Russia, China. I mean, it's not like, even if Biden is a continuation of Obama, those issues are still profoundly important and troubling.
Yes. Yeah. And they certainly haven't been made any better in the last 4 years. If you look at something like climate change, of course, that's been yet another one that's been made worse. Just by inaction, if nothing else, and also by variations, by the elimination of environmental rules with regard to greenhouse gases. I think the Iran situation can be made significantly better. My take at this point is that the Iranian government really wants to go back to the Iran deal. Mm-hmm. And I have very little doubt that the Biden administration will want to also. It's not perfect, without a doubt. But we lost a lot by getting out of that deal in terms of permitting them to go ahead in a way that they were previously constrained. So I think that will get better. When it comes to climate change, I have no doubt we'll rejoin the Paris Accords, but that's really it's a goal rather than an absolute restriction requirements. I would hope that at least things won't get substantially worse, although all the data now are that they're going to get worse even if we stop adding to the amount of greenhouse gases. That the environmental burden of heat trapping gases is so great that things are going to keep getting worse, even if we stop completely now, which obviously we're not going to be able to do.
Right.
So there's that. There are a number of things where we're going in the wrong direction, but in some ways, I guess I'm like that song from South Pacific, a cockeyed optimist,
You are?
I think there is some hope that some of these things can be, if not reversed, at least our slide downhill can be slowed down. I mean, when you look at so many of these things like population growth, for instance, even though the population growth in the world the rate of population growth is decreasing, population growth itself is still increasing.
Yeah.
So the relevant metaphor here is though you have a car driving toward the cliff, and so how wonderful you'd start driving a little more slowly toward the cliff.
Right. Right.
We got to do more than that.
Yeah. Yeah. But on something like North Korea or even American foreign policy with, say, troops in so many different countries and the continuation of 2 wars now going on 20 years, at least Trump didn't, invade any new countries or start new wars. In fact, pulling troops out, there's a lot of kind of libertarian leaning foreign policy people who think that's good. We shouldn't be the world's policeman. What are we doing in all these countries? And why do we have troops and bases all over the place? Why is that our business? And so what are your thoughts on, in the context of talking about deterrence and these sorts of things and international relationships? You don't have to comment on Trump's policy, but just the general issue of to what extent should we be nosing around in other people's business like that?
Well, frankly, that's one area, and maybe the only one, in which I do, to a large extent, agree with at least some aspect of Trump, of his policies. I think the notion of ending our forever wars is an excellent one. There's absolutely no doubt. We have almost 800 bases, foreign bases, not just in the United States, 800. I mean, that seems to be a few more than we need. And so that if some wisdom or even sanity can come as a result of some rethinking in that regard, I think that would be all to the better. In other respects, the only other way in which I give Trump, for instance, now you said I didn't have to mention him, but he occupies so much room in my head these days in terms of policies as well as personality. I just can't. But and I think there's some really important issues there. The other one in which I give him partial credit with regard to issues of deterrence has to do with North Korea. Yeah, and I don't think that credit is more than partial, but I think the good thing he did was to reach out and actually shake hands and talk to this guy. He's a jerk. I think both of them are jerks, but Kim Jong-un is a very dangerous, murderous dictator, but not to talk to him at all doesn't strike me as a good policy. And to have reached out and initiated that, I think is a good thing. Yeah. In that sense, I give him credit. Where I think there's a real problem, one of the subsets in my book is called How Do You Solve the Problem of Korea? Right. from The Sound of Music, How Do You Solve the Problem of Maria? Right. And Korea really is a problem. In many ways, I think Trump made it much worse because of raising the level of angry discourse. To a point that we could well have had a nuclear war with Korea. I was really quite frightened, and a lot of other people I know who were into this issue, knew more about Korea than I, felt equally. But you mean a localized war?
You mean just like a localized war, say in South Korea or in Japan or maybe Hawaii, but certainly not mainland United States.
Well, not mainland conventional war, but it looks very much like the North Koreans have missiles capable of reaching the United States. It's unclear whether they have miniaturized nuclear weapons sufficiently to be able to mount them on these missiles, but I'd sure as hell not want to find out. And
right.
So I think there's a real chance that there could have been and still could be a nuclear exchange, if you want to use this somewhat milder word. But so you had a lot of trumpeting, including such things from the American administration that North Korea is no longer a nuclear threat. Well, unfortunately, that's just bullshit. The nuclear arsenal of the North Koreans plus their missile arsenal has increased. So on the one hand, you had the American administration raging about fire and fury, et cetera, and really raising the temperature and making it all the more dangerous that there could be a miscalculation, and yet it hasn't happened. Backed off, had actual meetings. The way I tend to think about this is, if a guy came into your house and poured gasoline all over the floor, it took him a book of matches, but didn't light it, are you going to thank him for having not?
Right.
I think he brought things really close, much closer than was called for. But let me add just one thing, if I may, Michael, because one of my main concerns for a long time now has been deterrence. I take a stronger position than most anti-nuclear activists with regard to deterrence. I think even deterrence, or maybe even especially deterrence, is a very dangerous, ill-advised thing. And one example here is North Korea really represents a case of deterrence run amok. That is to say, I think the evidence is overwhelming that the Kim regime really doesn't want to die. They don't want to destroy themselves. They want to keep going in perpetuity. But they're terrified that we're going to attack them.
Right.
And so they've gotten really hyper vigilant, hyper deterrent in their own world, by their own lights. And the result is that by going so far, they didn't even need nuclear weapons to deter us or deter the South Koreans. They have tens of thousands of artillery pieces right on the border, ready to demolish Seoul without nuclear weapons. But by going so far, what they've done is generated enormous anxiety, not just in the United States, but in South Korea and in Japan. And the result has been to ratchet up tensions, increase the militarization in the area, and make things worse. And just a final thing on my little rant here, I think that's another example, one of many, of how deterrence misrepresented and misbehaving with regard to deterrence has made things worse rather than better.
Right. Well, if we apply the principle of interchangeable perspectives and try to see it from Kim's point of view, the Kim regime, the United States does not mess around with countries that have nuclear weapons. We respect them, right? I mean, if you want a chair at the table with the big boys, from his perspective, I kind of feel like that's what he's doing. Like, you can't fuck with me now because look what I have. And, it's in terms of the psychology of deterrence, maybe he doesn't need it for real deterrence, but psychologically or maybe politically, it feels like to him that's what, is needed. And I kind of see the perspective from other countries, like, again, back to this, why should the United States be the world's police? The only nuclear power in the world that, Russia had it. So, we would have preferred that they didn't. But once they had it, it's like, okay, well, now there's 2, and then there's 3, and then there's 4, and now there's 9, if you count Israel, which still denies that it has nuclear weapons. Do you know that story? Alan Dershowitz tells this story about meeting with, I think it was Benjamin Netanyahu, and Netanyahu asked him, so do you think OJ really did it? And he said, Let me ask you something. Do you really have nuclear weapons? He says, I can't tell you that. And he goes, right.
Ditto.
Right.
It's cute. I had not heard that.
Yeah, it's a funny story. Yeah. Anyway, so again, I could kind of see the perspective, like, why should the it be like maybe countries during the height of the Roman Empire, why should you guys be the only ones with a massive military and calling the shots? What in the 20th century arose this idea of I forget the title now, but where nations have their own independence and national autonomy, I think it's called, where you can do whatever you want within your own borders, and it's nobody else's business. That kind of arose after the First World War. But then that became a cover for a lot of bad regimes who were committing civil rights violations and even genocide on their own people, like Nazi Germany, whose defense was, well, national autonomy. We're allowed to do whatever we want within our borders, and you can't say anything. And of course, when England and the United States were trying them, we had our own issues with, Jim Crow laws and the treatment of blacks and Native Americans that the Germans could point to and go, well, so, what about your own civil rights violations? And again, I kind of see the perspective. It looks kind of hypocritical when we're jumping in other people's business or telling people like Iran, you can't have nuclear weapons. Why not? Because you're not one of the good guys? Or, what's the response to that?
Yeah, well, I think the underlying motivation, in fact, is racism to some extent. That was very strongly promoted. Well, it wasn't promoted overtly, but when the Chinese were about to get their nuclear weapons in the early 60s, there was this, you just can't trust these people. You can't trust these Asians to have nuclear weapons. It's okay for us educated, respectable white folks. But so there was, in fact, that as well. And to my mind, what that does is really provide a cogent argument against nuclear weapons generally, which is to say the point's often made, well, it's okay for us to have them, but you guys shouldn't. And so long as the United States and Russia and Britain and France, particularly, let's say, those big four early on, at least in the arms race, had nuclear weapons, we had no moral standing to lecture others. It's okay for, do as I say, not as I do. And so in terms of the actual reasoning, that I don't think there was as much reasoning as there was a degree of short-sighted racism. On the other hand, one of the reasons for being concerned, particularly about North Korea, for instance, and possibly Pakistan as well, is the reality is, and I don't want to sound racist here because it's not racist, but it's a question of local technologies. The U.S. technology, the French, the British, the Russian technologies are quite a bit better than what the North Koreans have. The North Koreans have been sort of piecing things together from outmoded technology from Russia. And if we are somewhat more than otherwise anxious about them, I fear it's for good reason. One of the main problems with deterrence has been the fact that it is so vulnerable to all sorts of blunders, not the least of which are false alarms.
Right.
Well, if you have lots of good fail-safe systems, you have some reason to hope, if not believe, that you're not going to blunder into a nuclear war. I don't know. I don't think anyone in the West knows what sort of fail-safe systems, if any, North Korea has. Or Iran if they were to develop them. But my guess is they won't be as good as ours. I don't mean to sound racist here. I think that's a pure function of the level of technology.
And how much money you have to spend on your program to make it, to build in several layers of safety. Because, as you document in the book, there's really expensive, these nuclear programs. And I remember when Trump announced he wanted to upgrade ours because he'd seen that 60 Minutes piece where back like in 2014 or so, where they had a camera crew in one of these installations where they were still using these big, huge floppy disks. That was just like 25 years out of date. And, okay, well, what would it take to upgrade from big floppy disks to whatever the latest technology is for what they need. A lot of money, billions of dollars. And, as a little sidebar, sometimes I think, like after reading your sections in the book on how much we spend, what if you spent all that money on like diplomatic relationships and training people in diplomacy and foreign relations? That is, spend the money having good relations with other countries, because that's ultimately what's going to solve the problem. Is this: we don't need nuclear weapons because we're friendly with them.
Yeah, no one really worries, at least I don't know of anyone who worries, that the United States is going to be attacked by the UK.
Right.
Or France.
Right.
Or Israel. And so to maintain good relations with other countries, I agree, would be a far, far superior investment. I would argue that for all of my anti-nuclear inclinations, and inclinations is probably too weak a word here, one thing we could do and should do is to upgrade some aspects of communications and various fail-safe procedures. Floppy disks. I mean, my God, I can barely remember when I used to use floppy disks.
Right.
We need to upgrade. And indeed, one of the things that's happened, if you look at the near misses that we have experienced, and by the way, we know virtually nothing about near misses, say that the Russians have experienced. They're very closed. They play their cards very close to their chest. But in the U.S., among those things that have come disturbingly, horrifyingly close, one of them was the failure of a single computer chip that was estimated at value of 46 cents. And that the result of that failure, we came within minutes of dying, you and me and just about everyone we love. So I think we could invest in that sort of thing.
Right.
What we should invest in are those nuclear weapons that are provocative. And one of the big problems with deterrence is there seems to be an almost unstoppable momentum to keep investing in new things that, in fact, don't enhance deterrence, but rather undermine it. And that's a real problem in itself.
Yeah, you talk about this idea that the nuclear genie is out of the bottle and we can never put it back in. But that's not true. I mean, there have been other weapons of mass destruction that could have been built, or they were built, like the Gustav gun in the First World War. I mean, this thing was so massive, it could only be moved by train, and it could shoot a shell, like, I don't know, hundreds of miles. And just, it was a pretty terrifying weapon. And yet no one talks about the Gustav gun genie is out of the bottle and we can't put it back in, or even poison gas. I mean, even Hitler didn't use poison gas in the Second World War. Of course, he had no qualms about using it on the Jews, but not against other countries in military, because there was something of a taboo about it and so on, even though we still have it. And no one talks about the poison gas genie is out of the bottle, or maybe they do, but not like nuclear weapons. So there's nothing, there's no law of nature that says, well, we can never uninvent it. And another, just this little sidebar that I've been thinking about is this meme that when I was researching the Holocaust originally, the meme was no Hitler, no Holocaust. And the more I think about that, the more research and reading I do, I think not only is that true, but also no Hitler, no World War II. That most of the German military leaders, they did not think starting a war in 1939 was a good idea. They were worried that, it was too early, or maybe they should never do it. And I also now think that, this idea, how do you convert an entire nation of highly educated, cultured people like the Germans, that gave us Beethoven and Goethe and so on, to goose-stepping Nazis? And the answer now appears to be they didn't. That is to say, the majority did not go along with at least with the eliminationist genocidal aspect of the Nazi regime, and probably the invasion and bellicosity of the military under the Nazi regime. I suspect most Germans were happy about the economic growth in the 30s, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism, so maybe they were happy to see Jews, put in ghettos or something something like that. But I think most Germans probably did not go along with that from some of the research I've been reading. But they were able to hold it aloft, kind of like in the ether there, through the control of the press, concentration camps, lock up anybody who dissents from agreement, and then you get the idea of pluralistic ignorance, where everybody thinks everybody else believes this ideology, even though I don't. And if you get enough people thinking that, but you're not allowed to speak out because you'll be sent off to these prison camps, then the whole thing can be sustained for years, where everybody thinks this is the new normal, but it's not really. I'm kind of rambling here on this because I think it's an important idea that, there, but for the quirkiness of one particular guy, Hitler, we probably would not have nuclear weapons. That there would have been no need to develop them in the first place. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, certainly in the absence, I agree with you about the great man theory. I mean, for a while I was skeptical of it. I was more of a Tolstoyan, believing that the people like Napoleon, who Tolstoy wrote about a lot, who felt they were in charge of the world and determining things, were really deceiving themselves. But that they were in fact really pawns in greater historical movements. The more I look into that too, as you, I'm increasingly inclined to think that, I don't know about great in this, because great has the implication of
big man or something.
Admirable. But yeah, influential, immensely influential, highly charismatic people who are able to bend whole societies to their will. And Hitler was certainly one of them, as was Mussolini, as was Stalin, as was Mao. I feared, frankly, that Donald Trump might have been one of these, but he's not, and I'm delighted that he isn't. I think you're right that in the absence of that, I don't know that we wouldn't have had nuclear weapons eventually. There was a fair amount of research going on. The whole splitting of the atom was being, the atomic theory generally was being explored, not just theoretically, but empirically in laboratories. I suspect I have no doubt we would have had nuclear energy as we did in at Chicago. There were the first atomic pile was developed in Chicago at Stagg Field under the athletic field there. But I very much doubt there would have been anything like the Manhattan Project and this huge rush to develop nuclear weapons, after which there was a profound domino effect, of course. I mean, the U.S. developed nuclear weapons, maybe or in large part to beat Hitler to it. Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons because of the United States to deter, getting back to deterrence again, to deter the United States. China developed nuclear weapons to deter the Soviet Union. China and the Soviet Union were very much on the outs at that time. India developed nuclear weapons to deter China. India and China had a war in 1962. It wasn't a huge war, but for them it was certainly a war.
Yeah.
And they lost. The Indians lost to the Chinese. And then the Pakistanis developed nuclear weapons. Why? To deter the Indians. The North Koreans have developed nuclear weapons to deter the United States. Israel developed nuclear weapons to deter the other Arabs that surround them. And if Egypt, Saudi Arabia develop nuclear weapons, it'll be to deter Israel. So if nothing else, I'm not at all convinced that nuclear weapons have deterred wars, and we can go into that for sure. But one thing that they've certainly done is to encourage proliferation.
Yeah. Yeah. One more point on Trump, though, as we've seen, it's been really difficult for people in his own party to stand up to him because he can denounce them. And he apparently had that kind of pull, at least within the party. And, a lot of these guys lost their elections for, Senate and the House races and midterms because they had, gone against Trump. Now, of course, he couldn't do anything about them. He could just denounce them. The failing New York Times. He couldn't close the New York Times. And he could call John McCain a loser for being captured or Mitt Romney as being weak or whatever, but he can't lock him up. But if you gave somebody that power, which Hitler had, where the New York Times speaks out against him and he just shuts him down, well, that's how it happens. So hopefully that can't happen
Yeah.
here. And maybe in a way, this has been a good test.
I think it.
Yeah, maybe this has been a good test.
I'm sorry.
That our system works pretty well. I mean, for all the Orange Hitler analogies people made, he wasn't able to do anything like what Hitler was able to do in terms of internally, controlling the press, controlling dissenters, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not for want of trying. But that's part of your point. He tried, he pushed very hard. He tried to get William Barr to literally indict not just Hillary Clinton, but Joe Biden. I'm not sure exactly for what, and Barack Obama, and even Barr, who was really a bootlicker for Trump, as far as I can tell. Even Barr refrained from doing that. So it's not like it wasn't attempted. And in that sense, the fact that he wasn't able to, and indeed is going to have to leave the White House at this point, I think that confirms what you're saying. Yeah. The system it scared a lot of people, so sure scared me. And in a way, it was kind of a stress test, wasn't it?
Right.
The fact that we had this who was so charismatic, had so many people following him, was so insensitive to basic democratic norms and even to the good of the country, was really pushing. The fact that he failed is kind of like a bank really surviving a serious stress test.
Right.
So maybe we can have more confidence than we would otherwise. That's a good point. Thank you for that.
Yeah, no, I think so. And there were a lot of Republicans, like, the Lincoln Project, people like David Frum and Bill Kristol and George Will, hardcore, conservatives for decades that hold to those principles and really believed them, who were just appalled by Trump. And they did what they could, but Trump couldn't lock them up. Again, he couldn't silence the Lincoln Project was making all those commercials that they made hundreds of them, and they spent a lot of money. Hitler would have just shut them down. Well, maybe Trump would have liked to do that, but he couldn't. And
they were very hard hitting too.
Yeah.
They did not pull punches in those. I have to say, I rather enjoyed watching these Lincoln Project commercials, because they said many of the things that I was feeling, and that many of the Democrats were reluctant to say, because I'm not sure why, but I think the Democrats, progressives generally, see themselves as sort of kindler and gentler and are less likely to do that.
Since you're a psychologist and biologist, I'll throw this at you because I've hinted at it already. Of a question I'm conflicted about. I'm not sure what the answer is. That is, to what extent are people gullible and they just believe what leaders tell them? Or are we by nature fairly skeptical and it takes a lot to get people to do extreme things? Right. So I mentioned, the Hitler example. I had Hugo Mercier on the podcast. He has this new book called Not Born Yesterday. And he's arguing that the research in cognitive psychology shows that most people are not that gullible. Cults are pretty rare. I mean, we all have examples, Jonestown and Heaven's Gate, and, these crazy people like the new one, the NXIVM, in which this guy got these women to get branded and have sex with them or whatever. But, that's how many self-help movements and groups are there? Probably tens of thousands over the last 50 years. Most of them are fairly harmless. People probably leave before they get exploited or whatever. We only hear about the handful of really extremist ones that really exploit their members. And the members look really gullible, and people like me writing for Skeptic think, people are just gullible. And that's why we need to be more skeptical. But in fact, maybe most people are actually pretty skeptical. Hugo makes this point that most political advertising is largely a waste of money. You rarely convert a person from one party to the other party. What you do with political advertising is reinforce the message to the base and get the base to get out there and vote and get other people that are on our team to vote. It's kind of a reinforcement of our team message to keep us in power. But the idea of actually converting people through some ads, like here's my 6 points of my platform. Oh, I didn't realize that. I guess I'm a Democrat now. And he argues that that's pretty rare, and not just in politics, but advertising in corporate America is largely a waste of money. We've seen companies like Tesla, super successful so far, zero advertising. So apparently people can make up their own mind about these sorts of things. And anyway, but I'm conflicted about this. There's enough examples of people being gullible that I think, people people are gullible. And, 30% of Americans believe in astrology or whatever. There's enough of that kind of stuff out there that's like, yeah, people are pretty gullible. But on the other hand, not everybody joins cults. And, most religions are fairly harmless, and people can leave groups, and they do, before they get, taken in and so on. Anyway, I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on that.
Well, I think that's, again, it's a very relevant point, and it's interesting and important perhaps to recognize, as people like myself tend to feel threatened, if you will, by what seems like the gullibility of so many, whether it's Jonestown or Heaven's Gate, as you mentioned. And it is salubrious to realize that the numbers who actually do so, at least certainly for these extreme cults, really are quite small. And the fact that they receive so much attention is itself maybe an indication that the rest of us, which is, I think, the overwhelming majority, tend to look at them and say, what the hell is wrong with them?
Right. Right.
So that in general, I think you're right, actually, that people are not that gullible. However, those who are can be very dangerous.
Yeah.
And I think not just to themselves, as we saw at Jonestown and Heaven's Gate, but insofar as there were enough gullible people who really bought into Nazism, for instance, and it took on a life of its own, where it wasn't just a matter then of gullibility. The gullibility snowballed into joining the group, being part of the crowd. And so you might have had a small gullible group to begin with, but then as it snowballed and increased in momentum, it became profoundly dangerous. And I need to add, I'm not just throwing a bouquet in your direction, Michael, but I think you wrote the best book about exactly that. That whole question of why do people believe weird things?
Right. I
thought it was a really important book.
Yeah, thank you.
Honestly, it helped me a lot. One thing, by the way, that I've written about just recently, I don't recall you included it in your book. Maybe if you want to revise it someday, because there's plenty of information, is the phenomenon of what my wife, Judith Lipton, who's a psychiatrist, and I've been calling the not Peter Pan effect. That's another one, I guess. The Pied Piper effect. I think one thing that may exemplify a kind of gullibility is this the susceptibility that so many people have to the Pied Piper, to someone who's piping a tune that they find just irresistible. And of course, the Piper got the rats to walk out of Hamlin, and then he wasn't paid. The town failed to pay the Piper. That's where the expression comes from. So the Piper came back, piped again, and all the kids of Hamlin went out too. So they were gullible as well. So Hamlin not only lost the rats, which was helpful in terms of their pandemic, if you will, but they lost their kids as a punishment. So there is a gullibility factor as well to a charismatic leader. And that gets back to the point you raised earlier about would there have been a Holocaust or a World War II without Hitler? And I'm inclined to think there wouldn't, because Hitler turned out to be a really effective Pied Piper.
Yeah, certainly the research holds that up pretty strongly, that he was very charismatic, great speaker, and Trump is very entertaining as when I watching the last couple of weeks before the election, this guy was just the Energizer Bunny, just endless, hour after hour after hour, and he's funny and entertaining. It's like, holy crap, I could never do this. I don't know how. Not many people can. Most politicians are pretty boring. And so that's kind of rare, but, also self-help movement people like Tony Robbins, I've met him. My God, he's so charismatic. It's like, wow. Okay, some people have that kind of energy about them, and they exude that, and people, maybe get swayed by that, perhaps. Another question I've been thinking about.
I think
I've been reading, I just started reading Isabel Wilkinson's book, Caste. In which she's kind of recasting, as you will, the race issue in terms of caste, like in India, that we're all familiar with two other examples, the Indian one being the classic one, and then Nazi Germany with the Jews, and then America with blacks. And the examples she provides are just so horrific. And it leads me to this other question is, to what extent did people back then believe these tropes about blacks or Jews or whatever? I mean, is it just a power thing? I'm adopting this platform of thinking of these people as inferior intellectually or physically or whatever, because it keeps me in power, or do they really believe it? And here's the context for this, why I'm conflicted. So I've been reading a lot of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's research on race relations, and he's pretty critical of people like Jefferson. And his attitude is he knew better then, and he still did wrong. And I've been inclining, like Dawkins does and others, that we shouldn't judge people in the past by current standards, because our standards have changed so much over the centuries that they just believe something quite different. They really did believe blacks were inferior. And Kareem's point is like, no, they didn't, because they had to put chains on them. They knew they didn't want to be slaves. Okay, maybe that's a good point. But did they believe that they were truly inferior, a different species, a different race that's, almost like a different species? And therefore, we shouldn't be too critical, because that was their worldview. It's different than ours. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, again, that's a fascinating and really important issue. I think the fact that slaveholders had to put chains on their slaves was not, to my mind, an indication that they felt that they were not inferior or superior, but rather they knew that they didn't want to be slaves, period.
Right.
So once you know that these people don't want to be treated as chattel, and you want to keep them for whatever reason, you've got to put them in chains. And so the fact that they I have no doubt they recognized that the overwhelming majority of slaves didn't want to be enslaved.
Right.
Whether they really believed that they were inferior is a question. I don't know that we have much ability to answer that. There is the standard line, and in that sense, I kind of agree with Abdul-Jabbar that there's maybe an excessive tendency to say, well, so-and-so was just a person of his times. And certainly it was often self-serving. I mean, if you have the opportunity of running a huge plantation and you can get 1,000 human slaves to do it and pay them essentially nothing except for a little bit of room and board, it's in your interest to do it. And so whether they really actually even ask themselves about the humanity of these people, I think is questionable. My guess is they refrained from even allowing themselves to question that.
Think about it.
But with regard to that, there is a book out fairly recently by, and I acknowledge this is a friend of mine, that you might want to look at or even have on your show. His name is David Livingston Smith.
Oh, I know David.
And okay. Well, his most recent book is called On Inhumanity. And basically he develops that whole question of how is it that people so readily have perceived others as being less than human. Right. And often it's because it's self-serving for them, but sometimes it may be because they honestly believe it. And again, to get back to, if I may, to nuclear weapons, which is one of those things that I've written about a lot, concerned a lot, and are very prominent in this book. In order to engage in the threat to obliterate tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people, I don't know that it's necessary to perceive your would-be victims as less than human, or certainly not necessarily as inhuman, but you have to stop thinking about them either way. I fear that there's an awful lot of intellectual and emotional laziness among human beings, where they put on a kind of blinkers. I'm not going to look at this. I mean, I've spent time with many nuclear targeteers and so-called strategic analysts, and not uncommonly, Michael, they have. First of all, if you go into these offices, if you get allowed in on occasion, it's like the back rooms of an insurance office or a bank. I mean, it's not the clanking of chains with blood splattered on the walls or something. I mean, they seem very intelligent, upper middle class people who often have photographs on their desks of their wives and children and parents. And, I think in order to do what they do in terms of the planning, they have to turn off an aspect of their humanity relative to their potential victims. And unfortunately, I think that's something that we human beings are not always, but occasionally and more than we ought to, capable of doing. Blind ourselves to the actual reality of what, in any of these cases, these people are actually planning. Now, they would claim, of course, these are only contingent plans.
Right.
These are designed specifically to make sure that they don't happen, that they aren't used. But if you look into many of the details of how the process works, by my lights, and I think it's a very reasonable and unfortunate argument, they're actually making it more likely, not less. But even that wouldn't be allowed if people allowed themselves to do as Bertrand Russell said: remember your humanity and forget the rest.
Yeah, they probably do have to turn that off, much like I suppose surgeons do when they're in surgery. You can't think of this as a person that I care about or whatever. I just have to do my job. So these guys had pictures of their families there on their desk, and they're planning to drop a multi-megaton weapon on a town. And it may have a military base near there or missile silos or whatever, but 99% of the people that are going to die are just regular folks. They're just citizens. They're not military people. And they probably can't let themselves think, well, those people have children, and the children are out there in the playground on the swings when my bomb lands. I mean, it's just too horrifying to even consider.
Yeah. There's a wonderful piece of writing by George Orwell in his Homage to Catalonia. Orwell fought in the Spanish Civil War on the side of the Republic, and at one point he did some sniper work. He was a pretty serious soldier. And at one point he recounts that he was just barely peeping over the edge of his trench, and he saw a fascist soldier pulling up his pants. And he had a bead on him, and he could have shot him. He could have killed him. But he didn't. And he said, I couldn't do it because he was a guy pulling up his pants, just like I pull up my pants all the time. I mean, he's a person. And so he couldn't do it.
Humanized him.
So I think that's remarkable and fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, because
the guy had on the bathroom. I don't know.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
We all do.
He's taking a shit just like I do every morning. Okay. He's a regular guy. He's a person. Right.
Yeah.
Well, so that gets us to the kind of
not a fascist. He's someone
right. Exactly. Yeah. Right. There's a scene in Eric Remarque's book, All Quiet on the Western Front. I think that's the book where the guy finds the soldiers wallet with pictures of his wife and girlfriend or children or whatever. And he's like, so this woman thinks he's still alive and he's sitting here dead. And she's going to get letters from him for the next few weeks and think he's still alive, but he's dead. And he's, kind of reflecting on, what that means. And, that certainly is a game changer. So how did we get in this position in the first place? So let's talk about the psychology of deterrence. I'm going to start with where most people start these days, Richard Dawkins, in the selfish gene model. Here's how I put it. And what I'm doing here is building a case for the logic of aggression, violence, deterrence, and these kinds of things we're talking to. In other words, it's not a bug in the system that if we could just eradicate this tendency to fight or whatever, or to want to deter other people, then we'd be fine. I think that's the wrong way to think about it. So I'm kind of recounting here Dawkins' own thought experiment in the selfish gene. If you were a molecule, what would you do to survive? First, you need to build a substrate on which to generate a replication system inside a cell that contains machinery for energy consumption, maintenance, and repair, and other features that keep the molecule intact long enough to reproduce. Once such molecular machinery is up and running, the replicating molecules become immortal as long as there is energy to feed the system and an ecosystem in which the processes can take place. In time, these replicating molecules will outsurvive non-replicating molecules by virtue of the very process of replication, those that don't die. Thus, the cells or bodies in which the replicators are housed are survival machines. In modern jargon, the replicators are called genes and the survival machines are called organisms. And this little thought experiment is what Richard Dawkins means by the selfish gene in the book of his title. That title. A cell or body or organism, a survival machine, is the gene's way of surviving and perpetuating itself. Genes that code for proteins that build survival machines that live long enough for them to reproduce will win out over those that don't, and so on. The problem is that survival machines scurrying around in, say, a liquid environment, such as an ocean or pond, will bump into other survival machines, all of whom are competing for the same limited resources. Now, quoting Dawkins, to a survival machine, another survival machine, which is not its own child or another close relative, is part of its environment, like a rock or a river or a lump of food. But there's a difference between a survival machine and a rock. A survival machine is inclined to hit back if exploited. This is because it too is a machine that holds its immortal genes in trust for the future, and it too will stop at nothing to preserve them. Thus, Dawkins concludes, natural selection favors genes that control their survival machines in such a way that they make the best use of their environment. This includes making the best use of other survival machines, both of the same and different species. So, in other words, if you're being approached by a predator, you should deter this predator. This is a good thing to do. This is totally logical. Whether it's you develop, armor or thick fur or claws or fangs or poisonous toxins that you exude, whatever it is, there's kind of a logic to that. So then, of course, scaling up, you know where this is all going because you've done this yourself. It's kind of a game theory. It makes sense then to push back against somebody that's going to exploit you. The bully, the free rider, these have to be dealt with in some kind of way. So you start gently with, just say, hey, don't do that, or that's not nice, or you push back. But if it escalates, then at some point, violence is kind of a logical outcome of this. Anyway, so let's pick it up there and talk about, because you start with animals and work your way up to humans and then nations.
Right. Well, of course, there is a whole series, a consistent, if you will, series of usages of threat and often violence in the natural world, particularly threat and to a lesser extent violence. I mean, even plants, for instance, blackberries have thorns, roses have thorns.
Yeah. Why
are they there? Well, they're there to threaten or to keep other animals, to keep animals in particular from eating them. Animals in themselves make use of threat all the time. Lions roar. Many animals show their big teeth. They show their claws. There are many examples of the use of threat displays in animals, which are most of the time quite effective. I believe in deterrence in many ways, in a sort of conventional deterrence. I'll mention on a personal level, we live on a horse farm in a rural part of the state of Washington, a number of acres, and with an electric fence going around. We also have, among our dogs, we have a very large Anatolian shepherd who weighs about 140 pounds. Yes, pictures. There he is. Yeah. I'm the one on the left. I'm the less.
Yeah, I was so confused about that.
Right. Well, and he's a profoundly effective deterrent. He is supremely intolerant of any four-legged creature other than our own dogs or horses who enter our property. And he has killed lots of coyotes and raccoons and opossums. And he had a fight with a cougar. He chased the cougar away. And I'm glad the cougar ran. Yeah. But so in terms, there he is. You just heard him. So he's a conventional deterrent. And when he goes off, he doesn't destroy our property. He often destroys the individual invader, but he doesn't destroy our property or our community or King County or the state of Washington. It's a very limited, very structured, directed engagement in deterrence. And I'm not entirely against, in fact, I'm not against conventional deterrence, even with regard to the military. There are lots of ways that deterrence can and should work and is very important and effective. I think what's happened is you raised the question, how did we go from these primitive, if you will, forms of whether it's RNA world or DNA world or early amoebic-like creatures defending themselves against each other, to a situation where we're now at risk of blowing up the world. And in the course of doing that, most animals don't really endanger themselves by virtue of the threats that they exhibit. Whereas the use of deterrence, not only as nuclear deterrence now, has not only metastasized and expanded to the degree that it threatens everybody, but many aspects of it actually undermine its own probability of success. And so, like so many things I fear with human technology, we've gone so far as to put ourselves at a tremendous risk. Now, many threats that animals and plants engage in don't do them any harm at all. They're usually very effective and helpful, and there's a whole catalog of how they do it. But as you move, or as we have moved to the level of nuclear threats, that's a kind of threat where if a mistake occurs, and we've come perilously close so many times, and there's so many reasons why we're undermining our own stability right now, which is the goal of deterrence. If a mistake occurs, the consequences could well be, almost certainly would be so catastrophic that it's a far cry from one amoeba going mano a mano, if you will, with another amoeba. We've entered into a situation where it's qualitatively distinct. I was interested in an observation by Napoleon at one point where he says, sufficient quantity becomes quality.
Yeah.
And he had so many men. This was in the context of his bragging to Metternich that he was He said, "You cannot defeat me. I spend 30,000 men a month."
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And that was bad enough. But if you take the nuclear phenomenon, where we're multiplying things by 1 million, in terms of explosive force, in terms of temperatures, in terms of mortality, you've gone from a quantitative distinction to really a qualitative distinction. It's like, you can be walking along at maybe 2 miles an hour, but if you're walking along at 2 million miles an hour, you're off into outer space and then some. If you have $20 in your pocket, it's one thing. If you have $20 million in your pocket, your world has changed.
Well, the Napoleon example is good because he kind of launched the start of a total war where citizens are all really in a way soldiers because they're supplying the uniforms, they're making the rifles, and they're sending the food and so on. So they kind of made it again logical to, well, we should say later bomb cities or whatever, because even though there's not a military target there, in a way it kind of is, because they're supporting these massive troops of millions of men on the front. There's a kind of logic to that, even though it escalates into perversion.
Yeah, and the whole notion of the home front, which became increasingly important with increasingly viable technology, where you don't just put an army of freed men out on the field with a sword and a shield. You have to have tremendous background material to support them. And so in that sense, no one is, quote, innocent as we've developed these improved technologies. Right. That's right.
Yeah. But, you go back in time, even before the nation states, city states, most of them have walls. So again, there's a reason to have walls. Good fences make good neighbors, and you have a dog that reinforces your fence. There's a logic to that, and same thing with walls and so on. But something definitely happened there. Let's just remind our readers here. I'm quoting from you, which I use this, just how many nuclear weapons we have here compared to, say, World War II, which was catastrophic even without nukes. The U.S. This is from you. The U.S. has a triad of nuclear weapons: land, missiles, air, bombers, and sea submarines. A single Trident sub carries 20. nuclear-tipped missiles, each of which has 8 independently targetable warheads of about 465 kilotons, or about 30 times the destructive power of the Little Boy bomb. So one sub packs the equivalent of 4,800 Hiroshimas, and we have 18 Trident submarines, or the equivalent of 86,400 Hiroshimas. In the words of President Obama during a briefing about our nuclear capability, quote, "Let's stipulate that this is all insane." How did we get here? I mean, so just kind of walk us through the logic of, you have Fat Man and Little Boy, and then apparently we had maybe 3 or 4 more ready to go in September, October, if we would have had to invade and so forth, to, tens of thousands.
Well, it's a remarkable story, in many ways a very tragic one, of course. And I mean, the simple, in a way, the most straightforward one, the one that's best known, is, of course, the United States developed nuclear weapons. And the argument has been made by many that when nuclear weapons were used by the United States in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was really not so much to end World War II, but to intimidate Stalin, right. Because it was well believed among many that Stalin was going to be our next enemy, and we needed to let him know. And also, we wanted to cut back our conventional forces in Europe, whereas the Red Army in Europe was really immensely large. Well, Stalin pretended initially not to care. He pretended he hardly noticed. But in fact, they began a very rapid program and were assisted by some spies in the United States. And so an arms race developed very quickly. And then, as we talked about earlier, various other countries joined in for a variety of reasons. One of the things, though, that's not sufficiently appreciated is the extent to which this arms race, which resulted in a very rapid expansion in arsenals, and not just in the arsenals, but in the technology, a qualitative change, particularly in the delivery systems, had to do actually with the United States running an arms race with itself. We were so far ahead, certainly up until now, but dramatically so in the late 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Initially, the delivery, this sounds like a UPS truck or something, but the delivery systems for nuclear weapons was the Air Force. Originally, it was the Army Air Force. There was no Air Force. Then when the Air Force was made independent, it was really entirely strategic bombers that were able to deliver nuclear weapons. At that point, the Navy was really pissed. The U.S. Navy didn't like this because the Army had a monopoly on this. And then when the Army began to develop land-based missiles, when the Air Force began to develop land-based missiles, that made things even worse as far as the Navy was concerned. And Navy admirals actually went to Congress and testified about how immoral and unacceptable the use of nuclear weapons against, say, the Soviet Union would be, particularly because they were so inaccurate. Okay, that it would kill vast numbers of civilians, which it would. The Navy, meanwhile, began developing its own nuclear weaponry and its own delivery systems, submarine-based, particularly the Polaris submarine originally, then the Poseidon. When they came online, the Navy changed its tune. They said, oh, well, yeah, nuclear weapons are really appropriate as a way to deter the Soviet Union. We need to have a whole lot of them. So they changed dramatically. Instead of saying how immoral and unethical, going against all the laws and rules of war, nuclear weapons were when it was the Air Force that had them, they became not just acceptable, but absolutely necessary. Well, the next step then was the Air Force. And this, again, the inter-service rivalry within the United States that drove a huge amount of this expansion. The Air Force then said, well, wait a minute, we need to, the Navy's catching up with us. They're getting the appropriations, some of which we want. So we're going to have to improve things. We're going to increase the accuracy of our weapons. See, the Polaris and the Poseidon Navy missiles weren't nearly as accurate at that point as they could have been. So the Army, I keep saying the Army, the Air Force then developed a whole series of ICBMs, which were much more accurate. The ICBM land-based, you know where they are, you can use them, you can aim them much more effectively. And so that developed the whole phenomenon, what we call counterforce, aiming at the weapons of the other side. So then the Navy, realizing that they were losing out to not the Russians, but the Air Force, began to develop another generation of sea-based, submarine-based weapons, namely the Tridents. And so this sort of bouncing back and forth, the competition between the Army, between the Navy and the Air Force was extreme and intense, and probably far more responsible than any competition with the then Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, of course, wasn't sitting idly by. They saw what the United States was doing, and so they began to build up theirs. And at some point, actually, I forget exactly when, it would have been in the late 60s or early 70s, they actually surpassed the United States, not in the technology of their weaponry or delivery systems, but in just the sheer numbers of the bombs and missiles and warheads. That's what, and they attempted to compensate by just gross size what they lacked in technology. And of course, by that time, other countries had also joined in the party. Now, I should add one other thing here, Michael, and again, many people don't appreciate this notion of counterforce that I mentioned, whereby the United States particularly led in aiming, in targeting the weapons of the other side. Now, this sounds like a very ethical or moral thing to do. It's kind of like the Lone Ranger shooting the gun out of the bad guy's hands. It doesn't even hurt the bad guy, you know. He gets shot and it hits him in the gun somehow and he goes, oh, you know, he's fine, right. He drops the gun. And that's kind of the image of counterforce in many people's minds. Well, first of all, it's nonsense. You can't, when you do that, as you pointed out, if you destroy missile sites and army depots and other military warehouses, you're destroying millions and millions of people. But another thing that makes this particularly appealing is the Soviet Union had only about maybe 200 cities of a population more than 100,000. So even if you believe in targeting innocent people as part of deterrence, how many warheads do you need? 200? Well, maybe 400 to make sure you got two for every target. Right. That's not very many. But if you get to target all of the weapons on the other side, particularly the nuclear weapons, but everything else, there's almost no limit. You can then justify thousands, which is what was done. Right. So another major factor that stimulated the tremendous acquisition of more and more nuclear weapons was this phenomenon of counterforce, not just aiming at cities, but aiming at the other side's weapons. Yeah. Now, if you don't, I'll add another complication here, because I mentioned how deterrence has this horrible habit of undermining itself. When militaries, and to some extent now others as well, not just the United States, but the Russians too, are fielding weapons that threaten the weapons of the other side, that in itself is tremendously destabilizing. Because even if you believe in deterrence, the basic idea is we prevent them from attacking us because they know that if they were to attack us, we could retaliate in such a way as to make that initial attack unacceptable.
That is now, to say, bad as it is, just to reinforce that, we can absorb a first strike and still wipe you out. That's what you mean by deterrence there.
Exactly. Yeah. And the terminology that's used is first strike. A first strike capability is the ability to attack the other side. Second strike capability, which is one of the important ideas in deterrence, is that after you're attacked, you can still retaliate. You have a second strike capability. You can nonetheless retaliate after having been attacked in such a manner as to make that initial attack unacceptable by your opponent. And that would prevent the opponent from attacking in the first place. Right. That's the idea. Right. But if you have a so-called counterforce capability, if you could, even just in theory, attack the other side and destroy their weapons, then that other side no longer has a second strike capability. And so counterforce itself undermines deterrence. It makes the potential victim anxious, sometimes more than anxious, that they might be attacked in a first strike and they wouldn't be able to retaliate.
Right.
Now, not that retaliating itself is such a wonderful thing. I mean, however, what it does, if you have the ability to retaliate in theory, then that prevents the initial attack. So as counterforce has developed, and it has, it's become the official policy of certainly of the United States, and as far as we can tell, of Russia too, not of China, not of England, not of France or Israel. But if you have a counterforce capability, then at least in theory, you can destroy the second strike capability of your opponent. Once that has become either in reality true or just in the mind of a potential victim, then things become very unstable, because in times of crisis, the potential victim whose forces are being, in theory, targeted by someone else can say, uh-oh, things are getting pretty intense here. They may attack us, and I, in fact, believe they may attack us, because if they did so, we wouldn't be able to retaliate. So what do? If things are really tense, you might want to attack first yourself, because if you wait, you're not going to be able to deter the other side. So this is just one. And yet, despite this tremendous illogicality, this tremendous illogic of counterforce, it's a very powerful motivating idea or goal. First, because it allows the Air Force and the Navy to justify having lots and lots and lots of warheads, because you have lots and lots and lots of targets. But also there's a legitimate, to some extent, moral notion in the military that you don't want to kill civilians if possible. The moral thing to do is soldiers should fight soldiers. So weapons should fight weapons. You shouldn't fight. You shouldn't aid cities. And so for many people, it's actually seen as more moral. And yet at the same time, it's profoundly destabilizing. And also there's just the last thing about counterforce. There's the issue of target practice, believe it or not. I mean, this is an ancient military notion going all the way back to the Roman legions and probably before, where you practice aiming at your target.
Right. Well,
if your target is Moscow, you don't have to practice. Anywhere near Moscow is going to destroy Moscow. But if your target is a hardened ICBM silo, you damn well have to hit it pretty much on the spot. So the pressure for increased accuracy as a result of this ancient notion of target practice is also itself very real and driving counterforce, which is, again, just one of many factors that undermines deterrence. One of the more dangerous ones, but not the only one.
Is that why Obama could not get through the idea of no first use as a new policy for the United States? And because of NATO, our NATO allies worry about that kind of logic of deterrence, that if you guys claim you will not strike first, then the other guys, mainly the Russians on the Eastern European front there, will think, well, in that case, then we'll escalate this conventional war and maybe grab a few territories here with conventional weapons, and it can escalate to a nuclear war because the United States has said they will have no first use. So therefore, he backed off from doing that.
Yeah, that was one reason. It wasn't the only one, but absolutely, it was a major one. There were also domestic considerations. He had to deal at that point with a Republican Senate who weren't going to tolerate that kind of change. Beyond that, there is the what's sometimes called the nuclear umbrella. The notion, of course, related to what you were saying, the notion that the United States was going, in fact, to defend particularly Western Europe in the early days, and to some extent even now, and Japan and South Korea, by the use of nuclear weapons. And so if there were to be a conventional attack on these areas, the theory would be that the United States would be able to prevent that from happening by the use of nuclear weapons. Well, once we start using nuclear, and this leads into yet another of the major areas in which both technology and policy undermines deterrence. Because let's imagine that there was an attack on Germany by the Russians, a conventional attack. Well, if we're to defend Germany with nuclear weapons, there are some real problems there. Not the least of which is one of the NATO generals once said, we got a real problem here. The German towns are only 2 kilotons apart. Which is an interesting way to measure distance. Wow. And what he was saying is, you use nuclear weapons on one town, you're destroying the other ones. And so it's like that old story about we had to destroy the village in Vietnam in order to save it.
Right.
You can't save Western Europe or anywhere else using nuclear weapons without destroying it. And so there's a lack of credibility in the use of nuclear deterrence generally. And that credibility, just like counterforce, undermines deterrence because, let's face it, the use of nuclear weapons is a pretty incredible threat. So imagine, let's say that you were a policeman with a backpack nuclear weapon and you're, protecting a bank, and the robber comes up and is about to rob the bank, and you say, well, stop where you are, stop in the name of the law, or else. And the robber says, or else what? And the policeman says, well, I'm going to blow us up. You, me, the bank, the whole city. It's not going to be believed. It's not a credible response.
Deterrence, yeah.
As a result of that, I'll try to be brief, but as a result of that, there's the whole proliferation of both theories and weapons that supposedly are more credible. They're more credible. Why? Because they're more usable. Usually because they're smaller. They're still nuclear weapons, but they're somewhat smaller. And the only way to make the use of nuclear weapons then more credible is to make them more usable. But the whole justification ultimately of the whole existence of nuclear arsenals and of deterrence is that they're around so that they won't be used.
Right.
And so you're stuck then in a situation where, in order to make the phenomenon of deterrence credible, you have to make the weapons more usable, which is precisely problematic because if they're more usable, they're more likely to be used.
Right.
And no one, not even Henry Kissinger, who was one of the first to point out this problem. He was an unknown professor at Harvard in the 50s, and he pointed out this problem and tried like crazy to figure out a way to get around that problem of credibility, and it has yet to be solved.
Yeah. It may be an insoluble problem because of all the logic of deterrence we've been talking about. Here, I think the idea of battlefield nuclear weapons is more psychological. That is, the taboo of not using nuclear weapons maybe doesn't apply to this one little tiny one here that's just slightly bigger than a conventional bomb. Say you have your biggest conventional bomb that's acceptable to use under certain conditions, and this one's just slightly bigger than that. So we're not really using nukes, something like that.
Right. Yeah, well, that there's a temptation, I think, to perceive them that way. But I also think that would be incredibly dangerous. Imagine a nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon. You could say, well, we're not really using nukes, but you are.
Yeah.
And if you do that, the other side is going to be profoundly pressured to do the same thing. And not only that, but almost certainly to escalate.
Right.
And once you're on that ladder of escalation, you're in big trouble.
Yeah. And
actually, one of the reasons, the greatest danger right now probably is between India and Pakistan in that regard. Here, India has a substantial conventional lead over Pakistan. As a result, the Pakistanis have been fielding battlefield nuclear weapons and have been giving potential battlefield commanders, permission to use them in the event of a conventional war.
Whoa.
If that gets started, it's going to be hell to pay.
On a related topic, do you know what the latest science is on nuclear winter?
The last I saw was in, 2018 or early 2019. And, for a time, nuclear winter, the phenomenon was pushed very hard by Stephen Jay Gould and a number of climate scientists, including Carl Sagan. That was criticized, I think, unfairly and incorrectly. It was criticized mostly by the Reagan administration because nuclear winter itself is a kind of if you understand nuclear winter, that in itself generates or necessitates self-deterrence. Because if the use of even a small proportion of your arsenal, never mind what the other side does, of your arsenal is going to generate so much soot in the atmosphere that it's going to really destroy the climate of the Earth for at least a year or more, then there's no justification for deterrent or for retaliating. And if you're not going to be able to retaliate, then how do you deter? And for a time, the data were uncertain. As a result of more recent findings in 2018 and 2019, because of some of those humongous wildfires that we've had worldwide, there's a substantial increase in the amount of evidence now about the impact of fires on the generation of soot. And at this point, the nuclear winter scenario looks very robust. Now, there's no way to know for sure because the wildfires that we're talking about here are trivial compared to the wildfires that would be produced by the use of nuclear weapons.
But it's a proof of concept test.
Yeah, in a way, it is proof of concept. That's right. Yeah, that's right. Not quite proof, but it strongly suggests the legitimacy of concept. Yeah.
Oh, the other thing I was going to say in response to you're talking about the bureaucracy of nuclear weapons between the different branches of the military, it reminded me of one of my favorite episodes of Joe Rogan's podcast with Edward Snowden. Who's working in the intelligence field in the government. He's in the inside. And, Joe and I both love conspiracy theories and love to talk about them. So, Joe's kind of pushing him. So what's really going on in there? Like, tell us, is it the lizard aliens? No, he didn't say that, but something like that. But Snowden's answer
Area
was
51.
Yeah, Area 51. Right? But Snowden's answer was so good. It's like, actually, here's what it is. It's just a bunch of bureaucrats trying to keep their jobs. And if they say, the threat from terrorism is very low, maybe we don't need this department in the next budget. And then we lose our job. So we got to escalate the perceived threat so that we need to hire more people and get, and compete with other agencies in just the same way you said. And so this is how I forget this. It was your book or one of the other ones I was reading about the number of targets that had multiple weapons aimed at them, not just 2 or 3, but like hundreds. I forget who used this example, but there was some base in northern Siberia that's only open like 2 months a year because it's frozen otherwise, a military base. But that we had like 200 nuclear weapons targeted on just that, whereas 2 would have done it. Why? Because we have all these bombs we've been building and we got to aim them somewhere, or else why do we have the bombs? So we'll just make that target have 200 bombs instead of 20 or whatever the numbers are. So you get this kind of bureaucratic fiefdom competition, which just sounds insane.
Yep. And actually, the book you're referring to was written by Fred Kaplan.
Yes, Fred Kaplan. That's the one.
Yeah. And he described that, in one case, there was literally a grassy field that was intended as an emergency landing field for some Russian Bison bombers in case they should need it. That was targeted for dozens of nuclear weapons. A grassy field, there's nothing there but grass. There wasn't even a structure.
Right.
I mean, and one thing that speaks to, I guess I'm kind of laughing with tears in my eyes. It's hard not to laugh because it's so absurd.
Yeah.
But this speaks to one of the other, what I call the skeletons in the closet of deterrence. In addition to the problem of counterforce, the problem of credibility, is the seemingly simple problem of how much is enough.
Right.
Let's stipulate, as the lawyers say, let's stipulate that the purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter an opponent. At what point can you rest easy? At what point can you say, all right, I've got enough?
Right.
That job is done. We can go on and worry about something else. And the answer is there's no limit. The sky's the limit. Heavens are the limit. 100, 1,000, 10,000, 50,000. And if you look at the history of how this was done, the numbers kept increasing. I apologize. I think my wife is grinding some coffee.
Okay.
I don't know if you can hear that.
I can hear it. It's all right.
She should stop.
So in other words, it's the other guy problem. Even if I don't want to escalate anymore, the other guy might. So I need to keep ratcheting up.
Right. And there's no limit to that. There's no end to it. William Perry, when he was Secretary of Defense, said he's absolutely convinced he could guarantee that there was no circumstance in which the U.S. government would agree to have fewer of any kind of nuclear weapon than the Russians did.
Right.
Just even though the numbers. Well, Winston Churchill said at some point, you just make the rubble bounce.
Right.
It really makes no difference, except for the psychology of it.
Right. Right.
And that's very, very, very potent.
Yeah. Well, David, let's wrap this conversation up by talking. The last 2 pages of your book are your prescriptions of what we should do. So let's say you're president of the United States, you have the House and the Senate before you depose yourself and return to your farm as a gentleman farmer. Walk us through the list of maybe the top half dozen things you think need to be done to get us off this hair trigger possible total destruction path we've been on.
Sure. Well, I think the first one is a more general one. It really has to do with a mental attitude, which has to say, disabuse ourselves or disenthrall ourselves of the notion that nuclear weapons make us safe. And this isn't a specific thing to do yet, but I'll come to that. The other very closely related to it is take a good hard look at deterrence and recognize that as superficial and primitively appealing as it may seem to be, it is in fact profoundly dangerous, and it undermines our safety and security much more than it enhances it. And moreover, it provides the underlying justification for the entire nuclear weapons regime. I think the whole thing is built on sand, and we need to acknowledge that. Yeah. Now, in terms of specific things we can and really should do, there is a whole list. One of them, and all of them would be relatively easy, actually. Not necessarily politically easy, but they would be technologically, militarily easy. Get rid of ICBMs. Get rid of the land-based ICBMs. These guys are sitting ducks. We know where they are. The Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, everyone knows where they are. It would be ridiculously easy for an opponent to target them. Because of that, they would be tempted to do so. Because of that, the United States would be tempted to fire these things off early in any crisis, because they are, in fact, sitting ducks and liable to be attacked. So they are really problematic. And even if you believe in deterrence, having strategic bombers and particularly submarine-launched missiles, where the submarines, once they're in the ocean, cannot be targeted, is more than enough, way more than enough. The ICBMs are just looking for trouble. They're outmoded. We should get rid of them, number one. Number two, we should give up completely on the notion of the kind of so-called modernization that the Trump administration has supported and at this point is moving toward, albeit gradually. Again, the only modernization that would be justifiable, really, would be improving the communication system so that we don't have false alarms. How many do we need? Again, one Trident submarine is more than enough. 2, 3. I mean, how many Hiroshimas would have to explode on the United States soil to inhibit us from attacking someone else? So we can and should stop that altogether. We should move dramatically away from counterforce as a goal, because that in itself is tremendously destabilizing. We should undo many of the very dangerous things that the Trump administration has done. We should rejoin the Iranian nuclear deal. We should rejoin the intermediate range nuclear weapons treaty. Those are pretty straightforward, and none of them would require reducing our security, and I firmly convinced each of them would enhance our security.
Would these require acts of Congress, or can the president just dictate it by fiat? Like, say, when Obama tried to do no first use, you said the Republicans objected to him, so he needed the approval of the Senate to go to no first use, and they didn't give it to him, or is that just more informal?
I think that's more informal, but you've kind of got me there, Michael. I'm not sure if this could be done by executive order or if it would require legislation.
Yeah.
In Obama's case, he was very aware that had he tried to do some of these things, he would have faced a revolt, not a literal revolt, but tremendous opposition from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, from the upper echelons of the military, and from the Republican Senate, which would have made it, I think, politically almost impossible.
Yeah.
Although legally, I think he could have done it. I'd have to look that up. I appreciate you raising that question.
So the no first use is certainly another one. And then talk about launch on warning. That was a little more complicated than I thought it was when I read that in your book. Super interesting problem.
Yes. I mean, the issue there, again, has to do with credibility, once more, among other things. I mean, there are many areas where game theory comes into this, and a number of fascinating strategic interrelationships. The idea of launch on warning, of course, is that there would be an automatic response on the part, really orchestrated by satellites and computers, such that when there was quote, a guaranteed indication of an attack on the United States, there would be a guaranteed retaliation. That was necessitated in part, according to many people, by the fact that these ICBMs are sitting ducks. Among the big problems there are all the false alarms that we have had.
Yeah.
It's just terrifying to look at the numbers of these things. If you have launch on warnings, if you, quote, take people out of the loop, then the next time there's a significant false alarm, we're all gone.
Right. So
launch on warning is a terrible idea, but it's, again, one of these things that's necessitated by counterforce, not so much by ours, but by theirs. So there's that launch on warning is an enormous problem and must never be done, because it literally places our fate in the hands of computers. Sometimes they make mistakes, not always, of course, but when they do, there aren't any takes-backsies here. Yet another thing, by the way, that we can and really should do is change the current military political hierarchy, whereby a single person, the President of the United States, has sole authority to order nuclear weapons use.
Right.
Now, having Donald Trump as president has kind of italicized the absurdity and the danger of this. I mean, he's kind of a one-man argument for nuclear abolition right there. But a really strong case can be made that no one should have the opportunity, the ability to launch nuclear weapons on his or her own. No one. Not Trump, not Pence, not Biden, not Harris. Nobody should have
right.
The best way that, of course, is not to have them. But as long as we have them, it's got to be instituted such that it has to be a decision by a number of people with the opportunity for others to question it. And this could be done fairly quickly. It's not like it would have to be done within 5 seconds. But to have one person making that decision means that we're all vulnerable to nutcases.
Yeah.
People who are not thoughtful, who are maybe angry, who are operating on an insufficient sleep, on maybe they're psychotic. There are plenty of psychotic leaders in the world and have been and will be.
Yeah.
It's just bizarre and phenomenally dangerous to have one person with that authority. And there has been legislation introduced to change that.
Yeah.
And it could be done on almost literally the stroke of a pen.
And again, the logic behind that is because if the proverbial phone call comes in at 3 a.m, you're not going to get Congress to all meet in the next 20 minutes to make a decision. So you need, just one person. Okay, maybe not one, maybe 3 or the Joint Chiefs, or, everybody has the red phone, 6 people or something like that. You're just looking for some checks and balances.
Exactly. So you don't have a total nutcase deciding, listen, I'm being kicked out of the White House anyway. I don't want to go down as a loser, so I may as well destroy the world. I don't think that's going to happen, but it could.
Yeah.
There's nothing legally to prevent that from happening between now and January 20th.
Right.
I don't think it would.
Yeah.
Now, actually, the way this initially developed was during the Truman administration. Truman didn't like the idea of the military having control of the use of these weapons. And so he instituted, I don't think it was legislation. I think it was an executive order that gave the president full authority. And there is a case for that, as you pointed out. Again, based on deterrence, if deterrence is to be functioning, then you have to have the ability to respond very, very quickly. But there also has to be, in my opinion, and I'm not the only one here, restraints that prevent one nutcase from doing anything like that.
Yeah.
And actually, one more thing. During the Watergate time, when Nixon was really going pretty crazy, he was drinking heavily, he was muttering to himself, he was wandering the halls of the White House in the middle of the night. It is said, and it's never been absolutely confirmed, but it's believed to be true, that both Henry Kissinger, who was the National Security Advisor at the time, and James Schlesinger, who was the Secretary of Defense, gave orders that if the president were to give any unusual commands with regard to nuclear weapons, before they were acted upon, Kissinger and Schlesinger, would have to be notified. Now, there was no legal basis for this, but they did this because they had real fears that Nixon was going off the rails, and you never know what he might do.
And he had instituted that idea years before of the I'm just mad enough. Let them think I'm just mad enough or crazy enough to do this. This gets to your discussion of the game of chicken, where 2 cars are racing at each other, and the one guy throws his steering wheel out the window. Then the other guy knows, he's not going to swerve. He may just be mad enough to throw the steering wheel out the window.
That's right. And that was actually first proposed by Herman Kahn, who was one of the early nuclear strategist, if you will. He said the way to win a game of chicken, one way to win a game of chicken, is to throw your steering wheel out the window, because then you can't swerve, and the other guy, knowing you can't swerve, has to swerve. Yeah. And so whoever throws the steering wheel out the window first wins. And so what that generates then is a competition to be the first to unscrew your steering wheel and throw it out the window. Another way to win a competition like that is to be crazy, and to be known to be crazy. Right. And that's what Richard Nixon attempted during the latter stages of the Vietnam War. He had it known to Ho Chi Minh that he's going a little bit nuts, and you never know what the boss is going to do. So you guys better give in and give up, because it's crazy. It won't really do any good, but they may nuke Hanoi and Haiphong, and we can't stop them. Right. They'll believe it.
It's so like one of my favorite scenes from the best film ever done on the bomb, the Dr. Strangelove, is where they discover that the Russians have this, the doomsday machine. Why didn't you tell us about it? The whole point of a doomsday machine is to tell the other people you have it.
Right. And they didn't tell, it's top secret. We can't tell them. But if you don't tell them, it's not going to have any effect.
That's like the guy that takes the steering wheel off, and he just puts it on the seat rather than throwing it out the window so the other guy could see. It's like, what's the point? You made that point in your book. I have that letter, by the way.
That would not work at all.
I reprinted this letter in my article, and on the anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This letter from Leslie R. Groves to the Chief of Staff, dated August 10th, 1945. So August 9th was Nagasaki, so the last of the two. And then before on August 15th is when the Hirohito surrendered. So he writes, the next bomb of the implosion type had been scheduled to be ready for delivery on the target on the first good weather after August 24th, 1945. We have gained 4 days in manufacture. Anyway, he goes on about this, basically saying we have a couple more left. Then he hand writes a note in there. It is not to be released over Japan without express authority from the president. So he must have been told by Truman, hey, you don't do this again without my signing in on this officially.
Yep. And there's an interesting history there of civilian leaders being, unfortunately, sort of appropriately distrustful of the military. Yeah. And some of that distrust, an interesting sidebar, is that the Bay of Pigs, which was, of course, a dramatic and horrible military failure under JFK to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. Well, Kennedy had been told by the CIA and the Joint Chiefs of Staff that this was in the bag. We're going to do it. It's going to. If we do it, it'll succeed, guaranteed. Okay. Yeah. Well, it was a horrible failure. As a result of that, JFK developed a real distrust of the military. The so-called brass hats, he called them. The way that may have been helpful and may have actually saved your life and my life and the lives of all those we love is that when it came to the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were numerous people, again, within the Joint Chiefs of Staff, arguing for a nuclear strike not only against Cuba but against the Soviet Union. And JFK didn't trust the military's advice at that point, right, in large part because of what he witnessed during the Bay of Pigs. Yeah. And so his distrust of the military may well have saved us all.
Yeah, there's that scene in my other favorite movie on the topic, 13 Days, about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So well done. But a lot of that was based on actual transcripts that have since been published, in which Kennedy asked, I forget who it is, it might have been the Joint Chief of Staff or whoever, if we take the missiles out and we kill a bunch of Russian soldiers in the process, what will Khrushchev do? What will the Russians do? And he says, nothing. They won't do anything. He's like, nothing? Are you crazy? What would we do if they did that to us? Of course we'd do something. It's like, and he's shaking his head like, are you out of your mind? What do you mean they're going to do nothing?
And then in fact, there's another conversation. I'm trying to remember. It was with one of the so-called wise men, a former Secretary of State, whose name I am blocking now, unfortunately. And Kennedy asks him, it'll come to me in the middle of the night. I'll call you up at 2 in the morning, Michael, and give you the guy's name. So Kennedy asks him, what should I do? And he says, you should take out the Soviet missiles in Cuba using either conventional or nuclear weapons. He says, well, what would the Russians do under those circumstances? And the response was, they will probably attack Berlin, and maybe with nuclear weapons. And Kennedy said, well, what should I do under those circumstances? And the answer was, well, then you should probably attack the Russian nuclear weapons in Russia, in the Soviet Union with your nuclear weapons. Kennedy said, and what do you think would happen then? And the answer was, well, maybe then cooler heads will prevail.
Right.
I wish I could remember. He's a well-known. Yeah. He was the Secretary of State, and
it's amazing how much all of this is based on. How much of all this is based on just sort of thought experiments of imagining. It's kind of a theory of mind reading. What would the other guy do if I do this? Like a chess game. If I do this and this and this, and then he does this and this, and then I do that, and he does it. And, we just have so little experience because we can't afford to run a bunch of experiments and to see what other people actually do under those conditions, because you can't really mimic those conditions perfectly. So
Exactly.
anyway, David,
Alice in Wonderland, through the looking glass, down the rabbit hole.
You've had 40 books. I think this might be your most important one simply because of the topic. I mean, you talk about threats in general, starting with animals and so on, but of course the whole buildup is to this problem. This is a serious problem, and that we have to solve this problem. And I think it's solvable. Logistically and technologically, and you outline at the end of the book politically what has to be done, whether it can be done by Biden or whoever in the future, who knows. It's really difficult. So, but in any case, at least we have the knowledge and people like you outlining how to do it. That's the first step. So thank you for your work. Thank you for your book. Thanks for coming on the show and talking to me about all this stuff. Super important.
You're very welcome, Michael, and thank you. And maybe in 5 years or so, I'll come back and we'll congratulate each other and the world.
We've achieved nuclear zero. Now we can worry about other things.
Right. Yeah, we want to make the world safe for global warming.
Right. All right, David. Thank you. Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.